Welcome to another draw-along session of 10 global pieces of architecture that represent 5 major periods in the history of Western architecture. What I'd like to do is first look at the media change we're going to do here, shifting away from straight pencil work to using design markers. So design markers have many different brands and many different color variations to them. We're going to stick with a series of simply cool gray arrays. So we need to move from your purchase price based on your own budget there to come up with a series of 8 markers through numbers 2 through 9. So there's no need to buy the 1 because it's fairly light, it's almost page white, or number 10 because we don't anything that sort of absolute black. 9 will suffice. We do need to purchase 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So over time, you will probably, if you enjoy this media, be able to get a series of each. So 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. For now, just one of each until you see whether you take to the media in terms of how we're going to use that. The principle here is that the ink flow is exactly the same every time you bring it to the paper. You can allow a little bit more pressure, but really don't get much more through the pressure until you actually coat it with a second coat of the same point. So if we look at a number 2, for instance, as we draw out a horizontal line across the paper, it'll tend to go on a certain tone, then it'll fade a bit as the alcohol dries. And it's absolutely smudge free as it bonds with the paper, and it's a great tone to start with, to sketch with, because then other tones will eventually eclipse this. So it's almost like drawing with a very hard lead in terms of the gray you get. Then we'll build that up to different values, marching along like we did with the pencil value. If we assume over on this side is sort of our tone bar, we'll have page white and then the 20%. And if you move through this quickly, you can see then at the 50% range, how much darker that'll be until we get to the 90%, which will be the end of our scale. And that range of value is what we similarly got with other media, pencil, for instance, in the future watercolor, to be able to get the full range of value from 0 to 100% on the page copy. So firstly, back up and try to employ these utensils here in design markers. And again, any type of brand is fine. I'm using Prismacolor today, but there's several brands out there that go through this range. I'm going to use Cool Gray because it's a little bit cooler than the other version of this, which are warm gray. So if you'd like a warmer tone series of images, then move to the warm gray. But make sure you buy the whole series in the same type of gray, whether it's cool or warm. So again, in simple perspective, when we try to draw architecture, by and large, most architecture is based off of orthographic projections of the X, Y, and Z axis relative to our eye height. So to review the perspective language of how to build out 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional piece of paper, we'll simply start with the language of the sort of science of perspective drawing from the Renaissance, which was rediscovered to show that even though we know the science says these are parallel lines wrapping around the cube, even the verticals are parallel, the horizontal lines, to make them seem 3-dimensional, as we rotate away from just seeing one side of it as a flat plane, and now we see more of a volume, seeing 2 sides at once. Our brain knows to call these parallel, they will never meet in space, and yet the mechanics of drawing allow for these 2 lines to vanish to one single point in the distance is actually on the horizon line. The same is true with the 2 on the left side going back this way. So simply put, if we were to place this cube onto our eyesight, in this case, if this is our eye height for a figure with a torso and legs, and wherever we are in the field of view, that our eyes are connected to that horizon line in the distance, whether it's a distant lake, a field, a desert, your view shed out to the distance, the horizon of the earth itself is tied by our eyes. So if you move closer, our eye height is still on there, but our head is larger since we're closer. The torso then proportionally is larger, And then it's the same figure, and we've created the depth of space moving back. And so these two, in fact, are vanishing to a point with their feet to something on the horizon line. So we put ourselves then in an orthographic projection of space as well. So to do that with the cube, we'll take this sort of elongated cube here, this block of wood, and we'll assume that it's a piece of architecture in the landscape, and that's going to be much taller than people, scale-wise. So if we have somebody walk up to maybe a 2-story building, we'll have their eye height about 1/4 of the way up the top. So if that's the corner of the cube, and that's the corner, then we said it's 3 more of those rising up above. That's that corner line we start with. The closest corner starts our perspective. And now the point is that both these horizontal lines are going to vanish back to a point on the right side, and then the two on the left are going to vanish back to a point on the left side. And you can pick whatever points you like for now. They can be equidistant, or one. What we'll do is put one far off to the right and one a little bit closer on the left. As you move those points back and forth, what you're actually doing is it's almost like a slow motion software. You're rotating the block around in terms of how it's seen by you. So you can move when you sketch on site to a place where you actually sit down in front of it and start drawing it. And the building will tell you then the movement of these lines and where the point likes to be on the line. If you're simply drawing on a blank piece of paper like we are, you can simply start the drawing and you'll rotate the view until we find what we're looking at here. So let's start with those 2 right corners and take them back to the right point. And just like with pencil work too, you want to draw not so much with your palm on the actual paper, moving your fingers. You want to kind of make your hand and the pen point all be one part of your extended arm and draw by moving from your shoulder. So hold the point firm and move your whole arm towards that point, not just trying to sketch it in along the way. And then reverse it for the other side, and we'll vanish this way. So now we can see we sort of articulated this corner now that might be 3-dimensional on this piece of paper, which is 2-dimensional, by using the mechanics of perspective. So now if we kind of employ our ability to see a particular proportions in space, a pure square on this facade would end right about there, and then about another half a square projects further. We can see in perspective that square as well at right about here, because if I drew it out here, you'd say it'd be too long and flat. If I drew it to here, it'd be tall and skinny. So here is our first square, and about a half of that takes us to this point. And since it's just a sketch, we'll just complete it as a rectilinear volume going off in that direction. Now, these 2 lines aren't parallel on the paper, but they're going to be parallel in our need to see this 3-dimensionally on the paper. So it's an illusion. So there is nothing 3-dimensional that I'm drawing, but it will look 3-dimensional as we add more and more line work, and then eventually the value to it as well. Wrap around on this side, it's not quite the depth of pure square. So we'll find that pure square in perspective and come back a little bit and draw that second side in. So now that's a start to make this piece of paper hold something that's 3-dimensional on that object. And to help that out and give some information about this, architecture sits on land, and right now it's floating on a piece of paper. So the land itself, if you're on a lot line, can come from that left vanishing point, any line you like out this way, and the right can return this way and show a vanishing point. So in a sense, we've created a base now that this cubic piece of wood sits on. And we've given that cubic piece of wood, here it's a scale with my hand, and the drawing will be scaled to the human being here. So it's about 2 stories tall relative to our figures in the foreground. So that's the first motion of developing a box on a piece of paper. And the first step of drawing in perspective is the horizon line, which literally has to be at the height of your people viewing the building. And the second point we did are the vanishing points, right and left. And they're always critical. There's only 2 for these orthographic projections. We'll talk about a third point later, but most sketches will just be the 2 that'll be dominated. But they have to work in concert, number 1 and 2. The third then, which employs our media here with the markers going across an array of values when you purchase 2 through 9 in any set you like, is we'll do it quickly with number 2 here first. is that light will create the three-dimensional quality as well on the volume. So right now, even with this dot camera I'm using, you can see my hand is lit by the camera lens up here. There's a lamp right next to it, which lights the whole platen of the drawing. And so that's the light side of my hand. You can see underneath in my palm that doesn't receive light, it's a darker tone of the same colored skin. So that's the shade side. And then right through the base of my hand open here, you see a cast shadow onto the paper. So we have light, shade, and shadow, which is in all three-dimensional objects. So we need to draw light, shade, and shadow in our cube form to now pull this out and demonstrate the value that we approach when we use these 2 through 9 media pieces. So we're going to assume that there's always going to be a place where the sun will be, or electric light if you're doing an interior, that you're going to have some surface that gets the dominant share of the light. So if we did that here and said that was lighter, this far side gets less, and then we see a cast shadow, which won't be true here because it's perpendicular to the lens up here. We'll make it as if the sun is coming down and hitting the paper and projects the shadow. So first we take our number 2 just for like a placement of where we're going to work 2 through 9, and we'll sort of teach ourselves that we want to kind of draw that value in almost in perspective, because there'll be lines left in this value, but they'll kind of bleed out and be less distinctive as we kind of move along here. But right away, it seems now that this is brighter than this far side to it. And then we'll take the whole background, if we do sort of a backlot to it coming off that right point, that's the plot of land that this building is on. And if it's a horizontal line, I'll always come after you at this point or that point, and then return back and return back. So that's a square plane that's now in the ground plane. And then the projection of this is that the light will come down the box and throw a shadow that angles off in a direction here. And then the top of the shadow is another horizontal line going back to the left point. We go back a certain place in time here on the sheet and return back to the right vanishing point. So now this very thin volume here is the cast shadow. So now it sits down on the paper and it's got more kind of language to it. What we're going to do is we're going to tease out more depth, because we've just started with this part of the value of the design markers. We have to move through the 50s, 60s, 70s, up to 90 by the time we're done. So we're done with 2 for now. That's sort of the setup of a light sketch. We'll move to 3 to get some other aspects drawn in. And what we'll use now is some natural aspects to the site that might show an adjacent tree on both corners on the background. And maybe that tree goes back to the right vanishing point with subsequent trees of the same variety. But as they come closer, they get larger, and they return and start going this way. And the scale of those trees remains the same to each other, but we see less and less of the volume as it dissipates towards the vanishing point. Now I'm using number 3 now, because I know that trees will be a very strong dark next to the architecture, so we can simply give them a number 3 value and maybe make it more of a stroke, because we'll see leaves and variations within the way the actual media works. So all media are a little bit different in terms of what they bring to the content, and then how you use them will be part of your ability to manipulate the image. So we'll simply start with that. And now all of a sudden, having that white against an even darker gray makes that a nice prominent corner here on the edge of the building. So let's move to number 4. And we'll use that for the ground plane here. From the back of the site to the front, coming off the left vanishing point, return back to the right through our front person here. And we'll assume that's a grassed area now, which again will be a strong green. And so we'll simply value that whole area out. Again, that'll have a natural texture to it, so don't worry about making it a perfect tone for now. And then we'll come to the underside of the trees, because as a volume Right now it looks like a flat two-dimensional plane. So the tree actually casts light onto itself, receives light from the sun, but then casts from that light the shadow of the brightly lit leaves onto a darker third at the bottom. So we can use that number 4 on the bottom segment here. About. So it's a quick step and it keeps you controlled because it's going to force you as you work up to 9 to make sure you're changing value along the way. So number 5, we'll come in and now we're going to detail some of the tones under the trees as it comes to the base of the trunks. And at the base where the building touches the grass in the back, and now I'll return to our cast shadow on the side. So you're putting a 5 on top of a 4 now. You don't have to be exact through the whole thing, and you want to sort of make it monolithic. The more it kind of shows through in bits of light and lighter gray show, the more it sort of animates the facade of the information we're drawing here. Maybe at this point, we could put a darker leg symbol holding up the torso for the 2 people on the site. Now to number 6, as we keep moving through. Typically 4, 5, and 6 are going to be the body of the architecture. You're going to spend most time on that. You'll lay it out with 2 very quickly. 4, 5, and 6 then kind of build out the heart of the project. And then 7, 8, and 9 are really for details of spectacle, because the whole paper gives you highlights with white. And we're trying to collapse grays around that to celebrate the white. Then we're going to drive information into the building with the darker tones. So number 7, what we're going to look at now are the edges of the building, which hold space beyond them. And that'll be the simple meaning that all lines have quality when you simply lay it out, but there's no real lines in space and architecture. You don't build a line, you build a plane of material that returns to a secondary plane over here. But when you draw it to create the illusion of 3 dimensions on 2, you want to articulate a difference between the 2 different types of line. And so the way to think about that is, if a line holds volume behind it in your perceived view, so for instance, right now, this line in front, if I pass the pen here or on that side of it, it never hides the pen proper. It doesn't hold space and volume behind it because it's the outside skin of our black building. On this side, our view, I can actually pass the pen behind it and it loses itself in a pocket of volume. So this edge is more important to us to articulate, like the back left edge, like the top part here against the sky, and the top part there against the sky. And so that'll help now pull the box off of the back of the vegetation there, for instance, and a little bit down here towards the ground plane where this starts. The value of the shadow will be stronger right where it meets the lit grass in front, the sunlit grass. And then we can take some of the dark again. Most markers you'll buy will give you 2 ways to kind of employ it. On one side is the chisel, and the other is the point. When you're working a little area and you want to detail it more, then you can come in with the point of the 7 here and drop in more individual pieces to give the character of the tree. Dropping down, and that edge is dark now against our bright front. And then as the trees diminish there, we show less detail. So it's a quick tone, a bit less over here. So that if you draw it well once, your audience, your viewer will carry the information on, even if you don't draw it. So we want to concern ourselves with that middle third of the drawing as always. So that's number 7. Number 8 is approaching black now. So we're going to come back in within these zones and put that heavier 8 adjacent to that. Dropping down. Here, that black lining a little bit stronger on the back there towards this corner. because it's got a gray next to it. You want to make that pronounced. When it's over here, the line can shift back to its original 4 or 5 value to it because it's against the light sky. And then maybe there's an articulation of the base of the individual here on one side, and there's a cast shadow from the sun coming off of each person. Now, if we articulate some of the language of what happens in the building itself, we can come back into number 2 and now give it some architectural detail. And one might be at that second floor area, if you kind of box it out in 2, there might be some articulation of architecture here, some crown molding there, and entablature, some base detail. And there might be an excuse to put in a series of windows that will maybe anchor the 2 corners or edges there. And of course, each window then, once you're inside the space, after about 3 feet on the ground floor, the glazing can come up and create a zone of information of opening up the box. And maybe there's a repetition up here on the second floor. So that lines out how you want to place that. Perhaps over here in the corner, there might be a column that supports an open porch. That vanishes this point, that vanishes to the right point. Since this is an open area, we'll see the underside of that roof now on the inside and a column out front, a little porch area there. So you can sort of design into it if you like, or if it's a subject you're actually drawing, you just focus on the content of that. So that's adding architectural quality to this wooden block here. So then you can come into number 3 as you build that up and step into the idea that the window itself, the glazing will be darker in daylight because the interior can't compete with the power of the sun. So we'll build it up with 3 first. Maybe you can jump to 5 and show a little bit darker toward the top there. Up and down, just vary it a little bit. So they start to feel like there's a way to move back into that space. And maybe over on this side, we can show that this side of the space, which is going into a porch-like area, is a darker value. And we celebrate that column out front. And maybe to number 7 here. Go back into the windows and show, again, a small part within each one. If you vary what you're doing with the tone, you'll animate more the life behind the front skin by things that change per room inside the space. So this may be the access point to a glass door on the front there. And the underside releases the least amount of light to it as you kind of build that up. So you create little tiny volumes of space in it. You can carve it out, you can add to it. Or if you're doing a subject, it's going to be very particular in terms of how you draw this out. Now towards the edge of this box design, as you work your way from 0 to 8 is going to be 9. And that's a very sort of articulate way because it's going to be a very dominant tone here for us. So it's almost black. So we'll come back right to the edge of where it's most dominant is the perception as this shade side appears brighter right when it touches that tree. And maybe there's some dark aspect from one side of the trunk of the tree. And then the underside of this tree is in shade from the tree in front of it. So that could go much darker adjacent to it. To our interior now, one final string of black. This is the least probably number of square inches of ink that's on the paper, but it's the most important because it competes with the dominant white everywhere. So to there, dropping a little bit of black here and there. Again, it's sort of irregulated now just to make it active. If you make them all cleanly the same, it kind of dulls out the interest level. And on the back side here, again, bring that black right to the edge of the building. Up top, the secondary one, and then probably no black further away from the building because then it draws the eye too far away from the subject matter. So we can come back in now as we kind of wrap this up, the last seconds of this sort of thumbnail sketch using markers. We can assume there might be a walkway that cuts through the front area, takes it to a front sidewalk, maybe returns along the corner here. And they could keep moving out toward the street if you like. You could plant and add vegetation at the change of the walk and sort of have a little bit more of a foreground of information in the front. And then behind the building, we're going all the way to the horizon line. And so if we projected that these were city trees along the edge of all the properties, they could come all the way down here and still be the same scale tree and the same size at that distance. And we could carry that line all the way across above our horizon and show a variety of types of trees in the distance that show a very large depth of probably a couple blocks or two away from our subject, just by tying it down to the horizon line. And that can run over here all the way through to the edge, because what we're going to end up with kind of sketch-wise, we'd frame this out probably where the edge of what you'd scan and present would probably be about this height to make sure your subject is dominant in terms of what the view shed is and scaling for the page. So that's our last key point with these markers, is to use the whole key aspects of value in all your work. So the values are light, your control of the sun, the shade, and then to get to the really darks, the shadow. And then if it works well in terms of your value, and let's say we went back to number 2, and if we want to work cleanly with the broad face of a number 2 marker, you could then come to the top corner and simply put pressure at the top and then drop the nib down so it's darkest at the top. So it seems like the quote unquote blue sky is dropping out and coming lighter toward the horizon. And it kind of fades over on this side and kind of fade it out. And then come back to that corner and hit that side again. And maybe one more time. And it kind of gives a sense of being a little bit more complete, so that now this white of the front facade of your little sketch here should be brighter in sort of an illusionary sense than the actual paper was itself. Even though we know that is scientifically the exact same piece of paper, it appears to be brighter now. And that's why your array of values can help you out along the way. So maybe a little bit more of perhaps a 3 or 4 brighter foreground, because that'll also have a shade side to it. And then the raised lawn area of the 2 or 3 inches above the sidewalk. And if you want to detail it out, the construction joints of the sidewalk that shows that movement going back in space on both sides. And maybe the depth of those in the distance comes a little bit bolder right where it touches the building. And they drop down toward the horizon and the underside. So as time allows, you can bring more and more detail into this. We won't spend time on that in this little video here, but a way that we'll end up some of the work for this series we're doing here on Western civilization is to go into then more delineating pens, so you can come have fine points that would come in and articulate details in black on key architectural information. So now, the formally introduce this segment here on 10 pieces of Western culture, they're over 5 periods. So I'll briefly introduce a quick model to represent those periods and give you the title of them. And then you go sequentially for the next 10 hours of sessions here with the language inherent in each one, kind of drawing those things with this new media of design markers. So the first one we'll introduce here in kind of another horizontal line of a timeline. We're going to break it into 5 sequences here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And it's not an even timeline. It's all in flux. It's all connected to each other. There are things that are ebb and flow through history. But we're going to start with the classical antiquities. And that classical language here is kind of showcased by, for instance, the Colosseum in Rome. And then we'll move into sort of its almost antithesis because it moved into a whole different stylistic idea of architecture, and the meaning of language has changed in the Middle Ages, the medieval. So that'll take us from the sort of broad-based change around 300 in the Christian era, all the way up to the rebirth. So this has got a broad-based language of why it's called this. The Renaissance, or rebirth of that language, and so we can look at it if the medieval is picked up by the Gothic cathedral here at Salisbury Cathedral in England, and the Renaissance is a new issuing of the classical language. So in a sense, rediscovered or reborn or reestablished as the dominant form here. The Renaissance takes us from about 1450 CE again, all the way to a period now, if I shift these around so we can see all the models at once. Let's see. A period of a change in the language of all architecture due to the industrial age, or the Industrial Revolution, which deals with the preface of neo before a style. So whether it's neoclassical, neo-Gothic, these languages are rediscovered again with the impact of industrial structuring, industrial technologies, building materials, building construction methods, which shift us towards the fifth period. If this is sort of emulated by the Parliament in England, which is in vision, it looks like a Gothic building. In planning, it's a classical building, and in structure, it's a modern building because of the industrial age, which leads us then to the fifth and final one of the modern movement. And we'll look at modern masters that sort of gave the Jennison approach to draw architecture in Western culture taller and taller. So a quick demonstration of that might be any major city, in this case, Chicago. We see Sears Tower here, where the dominant really epic of the modern movement are the master architects pushing the language of architecture vertically off the face of the earth. So the rise of the skyscraper becomes the dominant epic from the Industrial Revolution to the birth of the modern movement, which is more often not thought around the turn of the century. So we'll just make it sort of an easy 1900. It takes a while at sort of the ends of World War I to actually implement it, but some of the modern ideas that crystallize into the bulk of the modern movement are established through written work and paintings and things like that. So those are the five main periods we'll look at here. Look at them through model form and then draw them out. This time looking at through the sort of lens of design markers.